going? Kevin Cleary here with a knife video for you. This is the Nirk knife designed by Glenn Klecker. It's very simple, very cheap. I think it's like 15 bucks. Probably not a knife I would rush to put in my collection, except for that it is the sort of first and most straightforward example of a really cool locking mechanism called the Nirk lock, designed by Glenn Klecker. And I wanted to have that example, I wanted to have that handle in my collection. And so I picked this knife up very, very reasonably and wanted to share it with you because it is doing something different than a lot of knives. It shares this lock is used by a number of Brian Ty design knives, and I'll try to list those at the end of the video. But before we get into all of that, I want to say a couple of quick things. This knife is designed to be irreducibly complex. That is, to be the most basic that it can be, to have the fewest number of parts. And that idea comes from a book by Michael Behe called Darwin's Black Box, in which Behe, who's a very good biochemist, argues that natural selection cannot account for or explain certain elements that we see in biology because those elements are irreducibly complex. That is, they have more than one part that is required for them to work, and those parts individually have no genetic benefit. That is, there's no advantage to one element of this system, so natural selection would not favor it, and therefore it would be dropped from the gene pool and not propagated. Complexity, now that means is an argument for the existence of a creator. Now, I'm going to make a separate video on that, and if you're watching this knife video, I would encourage you to go check out the other playlist called The View from the Pew, where I'll use this knife as well and talk more about irreducible complexity and its implications for the creation of the universe and some of the problems that it presents for the suggestion that evolution by natural selection accounts for the biodiversity that we can observe. Back to the knife itself. The way Klecker achieved this was by this really, really cool integral lock. So the lockup on this knife is part of the handle. Look at the front of this handle. Here's the back of the handle. Notice that this long cut that goes right down here and down here separates the front and back of this knife and allows for the locking mechanism to work. If you push down on the back there, it opens up and you can close the knife. And that system is what makes this knife so interesting and makes me want to add this knife to my collection. This is sort of a quintessential example of Glenn Klecker's thinking and his arrival at how to make an irreducibly complex knife. Now, very quickly, the blade, maybe size and weight, 7 5/8 total length, 3 1/8 blade length, and 3.6 ounces. The blade itself is not doing anything special. It's 2CR13, 51 to 53 Rockwell hardness, so this is soft, cheap steel. Why even bother is my question. But nonetheless, there it is. So you've got a blade that I'm not a big fan of either the shape of this blade or the steel in this blade. It's hollow ground drop point, but you can see it's kind of a fat, short blade. I definitely wish this were different. I wish the steel was a little better, and I wish the blade shape was a little better. But it does function. I've used it. I've cut with it. And so it's not the end of the world. And maybe you really love this blade shape, and you just think it's so cool and interesting that you just, would buy every knife that was ever made with this shape. It's not really my cup of tea, but that's okay. It is deployed via deployment hole, and the deployment is functional, of course, and it deploys nicely via that deployment hole, but it's not terribly smooth because this lock mechanism it's sliding along the tang of the blade the whole time. Here's the lock, here's where it interacts with the blade tang, and it's touching most of the time. This is a knife I'll probably take apart in oil to get it moving a little nicer than it is right now. Let's get into the handle because that's what makes this knife interesting. Klecker has done a great job here. This is such a cool design. If you picture this unfolded, the way this is manufactured is that you take a piece of stainless steel that's this thickness, and it's punched out and then folded in half. And you can see on the back, here's where the knife is folded around so that you get this half and this half. On the front, there's nothing going on. It's totally open. It's only these few pieces here that attach the front of the handle to the back. Now that does give it a little bit of flex. So although there's no blade play here, well, there's a little bit now. I've been playing with the knife, but there's only very little blade play side to side and no up and down, but there is some flex in the handle itself. Okay, so that's because of the thickness of this steel. And this design would work. Manufacturing would be tougher, granted, but this design would work in a slightly thicker blade stock. And one example of that, the Nirk tie, which is a Brian tie knife that uses the same lockup, is much solider. There's very little flex in that handle, even though it's similar in design, uses the same locking mechanism. Gotta say, it's interesting how Glenn Klecker was able to put this together. I am interested in a couple of the knives that use that same lock, and maybe you will be too. So that gives you an idea of what's going on with the handle, with the knife. Really, really interesting design. Ergonomics are only so-so. This is a smaller knife, and I never find small knives to have great ergonomics, but it's certainly functional. You can cut with this. There is a finger choil. There is a lanyard hole that is actually a good size. And so it's not a bad knife, and especially for $15, it's pretty good, right? If you just need an EDC that you're going to use once a week or something, and it's just going to ride around in your pocket with you, I think this will do the job. If you're a little harder on your knives, or you want something that's a little more stand-up, maybe this is not your knife. I would say this could also function as a gentleman's folder. So maybe this is the knife you just carry Sunday morning to church, or to weddings or something like that. Again, that would be a legitimate function. And I will say the lock mechanism is really interesting. And I have a lot of people, when I open this knife to go and use it, people will be like, what is that? How does it work? Can I, and they'll sit here and go, wow, I can't believe you figured out how to cut that. So this is a knife that gets some attention, even though it's not terribly expensive. It's a pretty cool blade overall. Good little EDC. Nice, of course, because of the novel lock. And this is the main knife. So this is sort of the quintessential Glenn Klecker Nirk knife. There are other knives that use this same lock mechanism, but this is kind of the original one, which is why I wanted it in my collection. And I'm interested in some others. And just for your own knowledge, the new graphite, which from CRKT, has this lockup mechanism. The Nirk tie has this lock mechanism. The tie rod has this lock mechanism. And there's a CRKT knife that's, if you go to CRKT's website and look up Brian Tye's knives, you'll see one that has two blades. It was sort of a high-end knife they produced last year. That uses the same lockup mechanism. So all of those knives use this same pretty cool proprietary lock designed by Glenn Klecker to be irreducibly complex, to make a knife that had as few moving parts as possible and functioned just fine as a knife. And so it's a pretty neat feat of engineering, which is why I think this is a pretty cool knife to own. You may not want this particular one, but all those other knives are pretty good knives as well. And so just got to give Glenn Klecker credit for coming up with such a cool way of locking up a knife. There are a lot of pocket knives out there, and most of them use the same design over and over again. So it's kind of interesting when someone comes along and says, maybe I can do something different. And we got to give Glenn Klecker some credit for that, because this is a pretty neat design mechanism that he came up with to get this knife to lock. That's my take on the Nirk knife by Glenn Klecker. Decent little EDC, probably not the favorite knife in my collection, but I'm really glad to have this quintessential original example of the Nirk lock. There you go. Talk to you later, YouTube.